All right, so we've had a few new Senate polls come out. We're going to delve into them. There are not a lot of crosstabs in them, so we can't glean a lot of them out of there, but it gives us an idea of where maybe the Democrats are. So we're going to go ahead and delve into those. We have North Carolina, we have Maine. We're going to review some other polls that were, a few weeks and even a few months in the past. Hopefully, we'll get some new polls in the near future just to get an idea where the Senate map is for Democrats. Now, before we start, I want to talk about something that Republicans are already going to start saying because they say it every single election cycle. They say, oh, well, Trump and the Republicans underperform in the polls. The polls underestimate what the Republicans get. Well, let's go ahead and look at the governor's race, right? So if we look at the Real Clear Politics average, okay, we have it at 10.2% for Spanberger over Earl Sears here. But you can see Spanberger actually got 15%. So the Democrat underperformed the polls. As a matter of fact, the YouGov poll was the only one that got it right because it was the highest poll that there was. Okay, now if we look at Mikey Sherrill and her race, okay, the average Real Clear Politics average was 3.3%. She won by 13.8%. None of the polls were even remotely close. And look at that, Atlas Intel, the most inaccurate poll when it came to this. So I'm just saying this right off the bat that we're going to have Republicans over the next year say Republicans underperform. And I say, well, let's look at these polls. That's absolutely bullshit. And technically, if you want to look at Republicans in New York, okay, Curtis Sliwa definitely underperformed all the polls there if we're looking just at the Republican candidates. But before we continue, if you like this video and you like the channel about election analysis, please go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Like the video because it really helps in the algorithm. Comment down below if you want to know more about other races or any ideas that you have about the elections. You can also do a one-time super chat. Just hit the little thanks button down below. Any little bit is greatly appreciated. You can also become a member of the channel here on YouTube. You can also join my Patreon as well. My Patreon also connects to my election history channel, which I have a new video about Robert Kennedy coming out very soon in his 1968 campaign. People who are Patreons of that channel get early access. So thank you all very much for your help and support. Now on to the video. We do have a number of Senate polls that we're going to look at. So we have North Carolina here, we have Maine here, which I think we have an interesting dynamic going on here. So we'll look at that. All right, so let's go ahead and look at North Carolina first, and let's look at the methodology they have here. They have a 600-person sample of likely voters with a 4% margin of error that was conducted between November 9th and 10th. So post-election of what we saw in Virginia and in New Jersey. And the interviews were conducted via live phones and SMS to online. So if you get an SMS text, you can press a link to go online and then you fill out the poll there. So we can't do random digit dialing, kind of is happening here because they do it through live phones. But overall, I would say that this is a better methodology than, let's say, what Atlas Intel does, which is just get people who click on an advertisement and they put them into their system. So if we look at the two Senate options, so you have Roy Cooper as the Senate option for the Democrats on both of these. Then you have Michael Whatley as the Republican in one and Don Brown as the Republican on the other. I talked about both of those candidates in earlier videos. As you can see here, Roy Cooper is at 47.3% to Michael Whatley's 38.6%, with 38% of that total number saying that they're definitely voting for Roy Cooper. So he has a much stronger connection with his voters than those who are going to vote for Michael Whatley. Now, if we look at these numbers, they're slightly within the margin of error, but just very slightly. Now, if we go down to Don Brown versus Roy Cooper, we can see that it opens up just a little bit, 48.1 with 38.5% of Cooper's people saying they're going to stay with him compared to 38%. So this is a 10-point gap. So this is outside the margin of error. It's coming to the point with this North Carolina race that it's starting, at least with the polling data, starting to look a little safer. And we had some interesting results coming out of Wake County that I might talk about in the future that shows that there is a Democratic shift going on. So if we go ahead and look at our current map right now, I'm going to go ahead and put North Carolina in the solid Democratic number right now, in the column there, excuse me, because I do think that the Democrats are actually in a strong position in North Carolina. Of course, this can change, but I'm kind of saying the Democrats can, I don't want to say let their foot off the gas, but not have to worry about it and should maybe be on the offense when it comes to some of the other Senate seats. All right, so let's go ahead and go over to the Maine poll, and here's the methodology for that one. 783 Maine voters. This was conducted by phone and online from October 26, 29, 2025. So the fact that they have phones in there shows that there's maybe a bit of randomization going on. With the online number, we really don't know. The margin of error is 3.5%. So let's go ahead and look at the U.S. Senate race. Let's first look at the U.S. Senate Democratic primary, where Graham Plattner is actually beating Governor Janet Mills once the ranked choice voting is done. And as a matter of fact, it looks like he has a significant lead here, but because this will be a smaller sample size than the larger one that I just mentioned in the methodology, the margin of error would be higher. So this is still within the margin of error, but it does show Plattner doing quite well. Now, if we look at Plattner versus Susan Collins, yes, this is still within the margin of error, but we do have Plattner at 44.8% to Collins's 40.9%. But if you look at Janet Mills, she actually loses to Susan Collins. Now, I have said previously that I do wonder if the whole tattoo thing or whatever is going to hurt Graham Plattner, and I still think the jury is kind of out on that. The one good thing that happened is that this story came out a year ahead of time. You want that to come out, any scandal you have, you want that to come out a year ahead of time instead of a month before Election Day. So the fact that we do have the polling here with all of that information there, with all that we know, it is very interesting that Plattner in this pretty nonpartisan poll here is actually beating Susan Collins, but yet Janet Mills cannot. And if we're looking at the primary ranked choice voting and it looks like he's going to win the primary, this does seem to be a nice, decent little cushion for the Democrats. But again, it's within the margin of error, but you get the one with Susan Collins versus Mills, and it's still within the margin of error, but Collins actually has a bigger lead in that one. So it's not necessarily the most convincing. So as of right now, we have Maine right here. I'm going to go ahead and throw Maine into the Democratic toss-up. Okay, this looks really good for the Democrats. Okay, let's go over to the next poll. All right, so let's go ahead and look at the possible Alaska Senate race, because Mary Peltola, she could run for either the U.S. Senate or for governor. The current governor said that he is going to run against Lisa Murkowski in 2028, but there's a possibility that Lisa Murkowski might run for governor, kind of do what her dad did as well. So we don't know. I think Lisa Murkowski's days are numbered in Alaska politics, but you're getting two dynamics. You're getting a Democratic dynamic and you're getting more of a conservative dynamic. But when it comes to Dan Sullivan, I would say he's center right to right, but I wouldn't say that he is MAGA right by any stretch of the imagination. So as we can see in this poll that was done in October, we can see that Peltola is up 46 to 45. This is easily within the margin of error of this poll, but it shows that it is extremely competitive. And I hate to say this for the Democrats, it seems like she's the only candidate that seems to be really competitive when it comes to Alaska. Democrats have had a few good wins very locally and in Fairbanks and in other places as well, showing that the Democrats and some progressives are actually doing better in local races. So that'll probably push her up. Obviously, she has the Democratic support, but if you look at independent and third parties, Peltola has 56% to Dan Sullivan's 32%. Independents are huge when it comes to Alaska. They don't have the low voter turnout than, let's say, what we have with independents in some southern states and other places. So this poll looks really good for her, which means I still have it in a toss-up Republican, but we really need to put it in the toss up column now. It very much is a toss up race. Now, let's go ahead and look at this University of Houston poll done in the Senate race in Texas. Now, Beto O'Rourke, I don't think is a candidate. I haven't seen him announced, but they do have him in here. So they're probably talking about him being a likely candidate. And they have Jasmine Crockett in here as well. And they go ahead and create these head to head matchups with these four candidates against one another. And I do find it quite interesting that it does seem like they're kind of all over the place, but it does seem like Jasmine Crockett is maybe the strongest candidate amongst the Democrats. So if you see Jasmine Crockett here, she's at 57% against Allred. You see here, she's at 52%. Here against O'Rourke, she's at 51%. So she ends up being the strongest candidate. And it does look like Beto O'Rourke is the second strongest candidate behind Jasmine Crockett. So the two candidates that we have now running for the Democrats seem like they could be the weakest Democrats in the Democratic field. However, they might be the most electable when it comes to the general election. And then here we have all of the hypotheticals with those candidates that I just mentioned, as well as with Cornyn and Paxton, who it will be one of those two. They have Hunt in here, but it will probably be Cornyn and Paxton who would be the nominee. So you see Jasmine Crockett down by 6%, 50 to 44%. Talrico down against, let's see, Cornyn only by 3%. These are all within the margin of errors. So you see O'Rourke and John Cornyn, O'Rourke doing about the same, 3%. O'Rourke against Paxton, 3%. Talrico against Paxton, 3%. Cornyn against Allred, 2%. Crockett against Paxton, 2%. And then Paxton against Allred, which seems to be the closest one, 1%. So if we're looking at Texas, as of right now, is a pure toss-up state. And I do think with a lot of those Hispanic voters in the south part of the state actually starting in the Rio Grande Valley and all that, starting to become, come back to the Democratic side, we can see a close election here. The question is, who is going to be the Democrat running against them? And honestly, if we look at what we have here, it really doesn't matter who the Democrat is, and it really doesn't matter who the Republican is. So the Republican numbers are between 48% and 50%. They're within two. All of these Republicans are within two. When it comes to the Democrats, we have 44% to 47%. So we have 3%. Okay. All of these are within the margin of error, which means that we really have to make this a toss-up state. All right, so let's go ahead and look at the Ohio Senate race. Here is a poll from a few weeks ago that was done by YouGov. It's an online panel. It had 800 respondents, 4.5% margin of error. And you can see Republican John Husted against Sherrod Brown, the Democrat, the former Democratic senator. And Sherrod Brown is up by 1%. So this is definitely within the margin of error. This race is getting closer and closer and closer. Now, as I mentioned before in other videos when looking at polls, remember, it's all about turnout, turnout. These polls don't mean nothing if the voters don't turn out. But if a week ago was any indication of how Democratic voters are going to behave compared to Republican voters who didn't turn out hardly at all, then these are great numbers for Sherrod Brown. Now, in Nebraska, this will be an interesting one to see. We have not had a Nebraska poll in a while. We have Celinda Lake Research here having a poll that shows Osborne up by 1. Remember, Celinda Lake is a Democratic pollster, so we don't know what's going to happen. This is a poll that was released in September. David Weigel went ahead and posted it on his Twitter. Hopefully, we have some more numbers coming in. But so far, it seems like this race is within the margin of error. Hopefully more to come soon. So now we're going to look at my Senate map, and you can see Nebraska is now in gray, which is a toss-up. Now, my colors isn't by percentage. It's about the likelihood that one candidate is going to win or not. And of course, these can change, but it's one of those situations with the data that we have right now, and if the election were held today, what is the percentage? And even though I work a lot with numbers, because we're using polls right now, we don't have an election right now, this is more of a gut feeling. So I'm just going to say that. The ones that are in blue are solid Democratic seats right now. If the election were to be held today, the Democrats would win. And that's why I have North Carolina in that solid right now. Okay. The ones that are the Democratic risks means the Democrats have a possibility of losing it. And we do have the situation in Minnesota, Georgia, and New Hampshire, but I still think the Democrats are very much in a strong position. We just have to get some more polling coming out of there, but it does seem like Roy Cooper is doing much stronger in North Carolina than, let's say, the Democratic candidates in those states are doing against their Republican opponents. The Michigan one with Gary Peters retiring, this one is a little bit worrying. Now, I went ahead and pulled up some polling, just pulled up Wikipedia to look at the polling, and none of these firms I've really ever heard of. Rosetta Stone Communication, Normington Pets, Glenn Gariff Group. Now, maybe these are polling firms in Michigan, then they're specific to the state, but I haven't heard anything yet. I'd like to see a more reputable polling firm come out before I change any numbers, because you can see Mike Rogers against whoever the Democratic candidate is in the lead. And I do think of the Democrats that they have listed right now, they need to get some stronger candidates. So I'm keeping the Michigan one as a slight blue and incumbent party hold, because we do need some clearer polling. I've changed Maine over to slightly a toss-up for the Democratic side. It does seem like Graham Plattner is doing well in both the primary and the general in that last poll. We might have to pull that back. Ohio, actually, I need to put Ohio at a toss-up here. The polling is just showing everything within the margin of error, and that looks good. Same thing with Alaska, same thing with Texas. Okay, I do have Florida. We'll see if there's any polling coming out of Florida. The only one that I've seen out of Florida is from the University of North Florida, who's very, very dubious when it comes to polling. And then we have Kansas here. We could see what happens. Iowa, I'm going to be doing a video about Iowa tomorrow, so watch out for that video. And I'm going to be going over the candidates and the likelihood of how that can change, because I think if there's any state that we really want to watch to see how this election is going to go, it's going to be Iowa. And the polls that we've seen so far, I think some of them are kind of old. They are, I believe, within the margin of error. So if all of a sudden the Democrats win Iowa, which again, remember, Tom Harkin held Iowa. They win Iowa, Sherrod Brown gets back Ohio, North Carolina flips, Maine flips. All these have the potential to go one way or the other. But I do want to see what Iowa has as far as polling comes out before I make any predictions on that. All right, so that's all for today's video. Thank you all very much. Make sure to like and subscribe, and I will talk to you in the next one. Bye.